What I'm going to focus on today is really different, larger forms of genetic variation involving essentially gains, losses, and inversions of sequence. So shown here is a fairly, in a simple diagram, we have an example of some structural variation, operationally defined as events greater than a kb in size. So we have pieces of DNA that sometimes become deleted, we have pieces of DNA that sometimes become duplicated on chromosomes, and regions which can be in fact inverted or turned around with respect to another orientation. So this very busy map here represents probably about 3 years of work in my lab just to kind of characterize the general pattern of structural variation in 8 human genomes. So shown here are different human chromosomes, 4 from African and 4 from non-African. The distinctions really aren't that important. But what I'm showing you here is the presence of insertions, deletions, and inversions as blue, red, and green. And so each line here represents a different human genome that has been analyzed, looking for structural variation events greater than 5,000 base pairs in size. So a couple of things you can maybe get from this is you can see that there's a lot of genetic variation out there that is above the level of single base pair change. And most of the events that you're seeing here are essentially inherited, but we now know, based on studying roughly about 2,000 human genomes, that there's a significant fraction of very large events, often hundreds of kb in size, that are either individually specific or specific to specific families. So this is kind of changing our view of the dynamic nature of the human genome.
I had been writing nonfiction for years, actually, but secretly wanting to be a novelist. When I first started writing at the age of 30, it was with the intention of writing fiction. But I took a little detour for 10 or 12 years and wrote nonfiction, which I have absolutely no regret about at all. I think it was exactly the right thing for me to do. But there was that dream tucked away inside of me to do this. And I remember reading something that Eudora Welty wrote, who is, the great novelist from Mississippi who had a big influence on me, actually. She said, "No art ever came out of not risking your neck." And I think she's absolutely right about that. It felt that way to me at the time, and actually it feels that way to me every time I sit down to write something. Finally, in the early 90s, I took my deep breath and started writing fiction. It felt risky to me at the time to do that. And one of the very first things that I wrote was what I thought was going to be the first chapter of a novel called The Secret Life of Bees. I wrote it in 1992, and it is actually essentially the first chapter of the novel, as it is.
This is the first ocean deployment of 2 new high-precision instruments designed to monitor the Earth's signals from the seafloor. This housing contains the tiltmeter and nanobottom pressure recorder, and the associated electronics and cabling used for power and communications. The instruments were deployed on the seafloor by a remotely operated vehicle as part of the Mars Seafloor Observatory testbed located at a depth of 3,000 feet in Monterey Bay. In this first test deployment in the ocean, they have already detected the ground motion from several large earthquakes, as far from the Mars site as Chile and the Mariana Trench. In the future, the instruments will be part of a global network of cabled seafloor observatories. Because of their precision, these 2 new instruments are already detecting signals which could never be measured before.
We've also neglected a third sector of our society, that which we refer to often as civil society. Sometimes nowadays we just use the expression of the community sector. But civil society has been eroding. Family units have been breaking down, not strengthening. People's spirituality has been waning, not enriching. Volunteers have been falling short of demand, not exceeding it. And trust in our public institutions, that's been dissipating, not building. And so whose responsibility was it as I sat on the beach thinking about youth unemployment? Well, as far as I was concerned, it was mine. It was mine as much as it was anybody's. But in wanting to do something about it, I wanted to do it in a different way. In a way that was positive and not negative. In a way that would accentuate a solution rather than the problem. In a way that would empower young people to unleash their own genius and not be forced to conform to the conventions of older generations. And my idea was a really, really simple one. I wanted to explore youth entrepreneurship as a solution to youth unemployment.
The Muse instrument on ESO's Very Large Telescope has given astronomers the best three-dimensional view of the deep universe ever. By staring for 27 hours into the Hubble Deep Field South region, these new observations reveal the distances, motions, and other properties of more galaxies than ever before in this tiny piece of sky. They even go beyond Hubble and reveal previously invisible objects. Long exposures of the sky have created many deep field images, revealing much about the early universe. The most famous of these, taken in 1995, was the Hubble Deep Field, which rapidly transformed our understanding of the early universe. It was followed 2 years later by a similar view of the southern sky, the Hubble Deep Field South. But these images did not hold all the answers. To learn more, astronomers had to then look at each galaxy with other instruments, to split up the light into its component colors, and measure distances and other properties. This was a slow and arduous task.
Today, 150,000 farmers in India have committed suicide in areas where seed has been destroyed, where they have to buy the seed from Monsanto and buy it every year at very, very high cost. And that high cost seed is getting them into debt, and that debt is pushing them to suicide. What we've done is create community seed banks, places where we collect and save seeds, rescue them from disappearance, multiply them, and then distribute them according to farmers' needs. And about 40 community seed banks have been created across the length and breadth of India. Places where these have been created, farmers are not in distress, because the biggest cost today is seeds and chemicals. These seed banks have now been a new place where we can respond to the new crisis of globalization on the one hand and climate change on the other. Globalization has led to farmers' suicides. We are able to take seeds to these suicide zones and distribute the seeds so that farmers can break out of that dependency, grow food crops, get out of debt. We've been able to create community seed banks to deal with climate change, with the extreme flooding, the new droughts, the cyclones, the hurricanes that lead to salinization. And today for us, the work on seed has become the place from where we are responding to the worst tragedies and the worst crises of our times.
Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. The philosopher Bertrand Russell referred to Machiavelli's most well-known book, The Prince, as a gangster's handbook. And while there's no doubt that certain people have read and used it as such, I think that if we put it into the context of when it was written, which was Italy, especially Florence, in the 15th and 16th centuries, it will be easier to judge Machiavelli's reasons for writing it. Now, the Italy of that period was made up of a number of city-states, often at war with each other. Add to that threats from foreign powers, especially France, and it was a very unstable and dangerous situation. Machiavelli loved his home city, Florence, and wanted to protect its culture, history, and above all, independence at all costs. One way to do this was to establish an army of Florentines loyal to the city-state of Florence. Much of Machiavelli's career was taken up with this issue. It must be remembered, though, that he led an active civic life, was deeply into politics, and was an ambassador for Florence. In this way, he got to meet and observe some of the key players of the time, and through this came to understand the nature of power and how to hold on to it. The Prince was an attempt to teach Florence the lessons he had learnt.
There's sugar in a lot of foods where you don't expect it. And of course, there's lots of sugar in donuts or ice cream or pastries or other things that are sweet, candy of course. But there are other places where you see it and you don't necessarily expect it. So as an example, peanut butter. Here's a list of ingredients from Skippy peanut butter. You see that sugar is the second most common ingredient. Excuse me, you may know from reading food labels that these ingredients in any food label are listed in order of how much there is in the food itself. So sugar comes right after peanuts. Here's another example, beef stew. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find sugar in beef stew, but it's there. Now, it's down the list of ingredients. It's actually toward the end. But if you look at the marketing of this and look at the can, it says there's fresh potatoes and carrots, but actually there's more sugar in this than there is carrots. And so you wouldn't eat something like beef stew and expect to find this to be the case.
Okay, so again, here's the question. Is depression actually a whole body disease, one manifestation of which is depression? So does depression affect all, many, if not all cells in the body, but it just manifests in a mental phenomenon, or not? So here's a couple of facts. One, depression is the leading cause of disability in North America, and it's projected to become the second leading cause of disability worldwide in just a few years, in 4 years. If depression is purely a mental illness, or even if we're a little bit more sophisticated and we say depression's a brain disease, how do we explain this? Why do depressed individuals have a significantly increased rate of physical disease diseases that are usually associated with advanced age. So people with depression get sick more often than people without depression, and the sicknesses that they get tend to be the sicknesses that are associated with old age. Interesting. Things like heart disease and stroke, dementia, obesity, diabetes, osteoporosis, metabolic syndrome, immune dysfunction, and premature death, even controlling for suicide. And it's statistically things like age, hypertension, diabetes, smoking, perceived health, cognitive functioning. These factors are more common in individuals with depression, even if you take all of those things out of the equation. It seems to be something added by depression per se that leads to the increased risk.
Sea creatures are inspiring the latest devices that harness wave power. This one, called the oyster, sits on the ocean floor and opens and closes as waves pass over it. Cables attach it to generators on the shore. Since November 2009, it's been powering 9,000 homes in the Orkney Islands. Another device looks like a snake. The anaconda is made from a rubber tube filled with water that floats just below the surface. When a swell hits the front of it, the tube is squeezed. A bulge ripples down its length and powers a turbine in its tail. Prototypes are currently being tested, but the full-scale version will be 200 meters long. This system also looks like a snake, but this one is made of steel. It floats near the surface, where waves make its joints move. This drives hydraulic systems that power electrical generators. Like the anaconda, it's still being tested. Results will prove if these devices are up to the job of supplying viable sources of green energy.
China and Australia have become increasingly interconnected in recent years. Both have raised their relationship to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. In 2014, China is now Australia's largest trading partner, export market, and foreign investor. In 2015, Chinese investment in Australia grew to over $11 billion US. That is up around 33% on the previous year. In the same year, the two countries also signed a bilateral free trade deal, which took effect in December. In education, Chinese students enrolling in Australian universities hit a record high last year, with around 50,000 moving to Australia to study. That is an increase of 23% on 2015 figures. And this year marks the 45th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic ties between the two nations, and is also the China-Australia Year of Tourism.
We appear to take it as a rule, or as a law of nature, that each species is adapted to the climate of its own home. For example, species from the Arctic, or even a temperate region, could not survive in a tropical climate, nor could a tropical species last long if it found itself at the South Pole. But it is true to say there's too much emphasis placed on the degree of adaptation of species to the climates where they live. We assume that this adaptation, if all species are descended from a single form, must have taken place over millions of years. Yet a large number of plants and animals brought from different countries remain perfectly healthy in their new home. Also, there are several examples of animal species that have extended their range within historical times, from warmer to cooler latitudes, and the other way round. Rats and mice provide good examples. They have been transported by man to many parts of the world and now have a far wider range than any other rodent, and they can be found living in the cold climate of the Faroe Islands to the north, through the tropical zones to the Falklands in the south. It is possible to see adaptation to any climate as a quality that is part of an inborn flexibility of the physical and mental constitution of most animals. Therefore, the ability to survive in the most different climates by both man and his domestic animals, and the fact that elephants once existed in an ice age while living species live in tropical areas, should not be seen as deviations from the rule, but as examples of this flexibility being brought into action under particular circumstances.
Personal health monitoring.
So how do we take this noise and make it into a signal of interest was kind of the core of what we did for many years, and we're taking that work and applying it to other domains.
They're looking to take advantage of all the functionality built into our smartphones. Here, the user would opt into an app that uses the microphone to listen in the background for coughs, searching for patterns that suggest a trip to the doctor might be in order.
We construct these models that try and understand how sound works, what its patterns are, and we give it a whole bunch of examples of different kinds of audio, things like people talking, things like people laughing, sneezing, and of course coughing.
This app uses a phone's camera to check hemoglobin levels in blood by analyzing the color of capillary beds right through the skin.
Generally, what happens is if you're anemic, your blood's going to be a little less red. And we take advantage of that by putting your finger over a camera of a phone. The camera of the phone can actually see the coloration of the blood.
And this test uses the camera to help nervous parents who are worried about newborn jaundice.
Now, jaundice is something that doctors who have seen tons of babies can just kind of figure out on a very basic level of, is this baby, do they need to get treatment, or are they in a good condition? Whereas a first-time parent has no idea necessarily what jaundice might look like.
Patel says sensors like these, and many others, will one day be commonplace.
It is very important to take statistics seriously in order to be able to come to meaningful conclusions. For me, it is even more important to take statistics seriously because I am interested in understanding the effects of globalization and understanding the effects of international trade. So I, as a researcher and economist, am especially interested in the question, what does international trade bring to people around the world? And does international trade benefit people around the world? Especially, does international trade benefit poor people in developing countries? If you ask an economist this question, he would most likely tell you there must be some benefits to international trade to a country as a whole. But he would also tell you that some people are going to gain more, others gain less, and others even lose from it. Basic economic theories predict that especially those people are going to gain from globalization who own something which is more precious globally than it is locally. So in a high-income country, these are going to be capitalists, high-skilled workers, who are going to be the main beneficiaries from trade. In a low-income country, these are going to be low-skilled workers, who are locally plenty, but globally relatively scarcer. This simple economic argument lies at the bottom of the expectation by many economists that the poor should actually benefit from international trade around the world. But whether this really happens and whether this really occurs, it is an empirical question.
Here are Stephen Salas and Kent Redford of WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, pointing a finger at the poverty alleviation movement and saying in its new incarnation it's largely subsumed or supplanted conservation. The trend has gone unnoticed, but it poses a significant threat to conservation objectives. And what they're basically saying is, if you're interested in protecting the biosphere, you ought to get on with that job. You shouldn't be distracted by the equally significant but different agendas of reducing poverty. At the same time, you've got two British social scientists here. Dilys Rowe works for the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, and Joe Elliott actually works for African Wildlife Foundation nowadays. But she's saying here, poor people should not pay the price for biodiversity protection. So you can see the sort of the nature of the debate. What is the impacts that they're all talking about? Well, it's about whether you can achieve a win-win solution, whether you can achieve economic growth which brings wealth in order to cut poverty without damaging biodiversity. And the argument is that if you want to protect biodiversity, you have to focus on that as a goal, but if you do that, you run the risk of hurting the poor, and you also run the risk of inconveniencing or reducing economic growth. And we're used in developed countries, industrialized countries, to seeing this argument, this axis argued about with, let us say, a government wishing to start drilling for oil in place X, which is full of wildlife, and the Wildlife Conservation Society is urging them not to on the grounds that it's a wilderness refuge. We're used to that debate. What I'm saying is that in the developing world there's a third axis, and it's quite a complex one.
EU legislation works in two ways in terms of the way it influences our choices about the environment in the UK, and that's on the basis that the UK has some pretty challenging environmental circumstances because of the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. Britain, the UK, as the centre and the earliest nation to industrialise. EU law influences things in two ways. It's a constant pressure on the UK government not to slide back and allow things to drift. So it's always there. It provides, if you like, a safety net for the environment, and we operate our own legislation, usually within that kind of framework, to improve the state of our rivers. We still have some serious challenges with the state of our rivers, I should say. So that's the first thing, that constant pressure on government and government agencies to do more and certainly not to do less. The second way in which it operates is it provides a level playing field across Europe. So it ensures that everybody is spending some money on the environment, and people can't get away by saying, no, we're not going to do that, because if we do that it's too expensive and all our goods will be too expensive to sell, and so on. So it's a level playing field. Everybody recognises they need to spend something, and that level playing field, common legislation across Europe, is helpful in that regard.
Loggerhead turtles are the most abundant of all the marine turtle species in US waters, but persistent population declines due to pollution, shrimp trawling, and development in the nesting areas, among other factors, have kept this wide-ranging Cijoa on the threatened species list since 1978. The enormous range encompasses all but the most frigid waters of the world's oceans. They seem to prefer coastal habitats, but often frequent inland water bodies and will travel hundreds of miles out to sea. The largest of all hard-shell turtles, leatherbacks, are bigger but have soft shells. Loggerheads have massive heads, strong jaws, and a reddish-brown shell, or carapace. Adult males reach about 3 feet in shell length
and weigh about 250 pounds, but large specimens of more than 1,000 pounds have been found. They are primarily carnivores, munching jellyfish, conchs, crabs, and even fish, but will eat seaweed and sargassum occasionally. Mature females will often return, sometimes over thousands of miles, to the beach where they hatched to lay their eggs. Worldwide population numbers are unknown, but scientists studying nesting populations are seeing marked decreases despite endangered species protections.
I'm a dietitian and I work in clinical weight loss research. Accurately estimating portion size is critical in research or real-world settings. For example, if you're trying to watch your weight and you're out to dinner and you're presented with a bowl of food, there's no really good way to actually estimate how much you're eating unless you're going to whip some scales out of your bag. So we wanted to find a more objective way for people to quantify what they're eating when they're out and about. I came up with a more hands-on approach. We got people to measure the dimensions of the food using the width of their fingers, and remembering back to primary school maths, we used the geometric volume formulas to estimate the weight of the food. To show you how this works, I've ordered a piece of lasagna, and that's my box, a glass of wine, and that's my cylinder, and I'm feeling pretty healthy, so I ordered some watermelon for dessert, and that's my wedge. So this lasagna is 7 by 5 by 4 fingers. In the future, I see this method being incorporated into smartphone applications. So you put your finger widths in along with your height and your weight, and the app will do all of the calculations for you. And then you've got a more accurate way to estimate the portion size.
We're thinking about this and we're trying to say, all right, well, let's file a patent on this clicker. If I were to go to the patent office and say, all right, I want a patent on a clicker, period. The patent office would just laugh. You know, the clickers have been around for a while, presentation clickers have been around for a while, and so there'd be a 0% chance that we would actually get that. If we were to somehow convince the patent office that we should be able to get a patent on a clicker, period, it would, however, be incredibly valuable. Every single clicker that was made after this point would infringe. And when it infringes, maybe we take $1 or $2 each. That would add up to be a decent amount of money. On the other end of the spectrum, let's go to the million-word version. I go to the patent office and I say, I want a patent on this exact thing. And those million words describe every single radius, every single material, every single thing about this. And the patent office says, yeah, we've never seen that before. Go ahead and take it. Almost 100% chance of getting that patent. But the value of that patent would be close to 0.
Innovation equals invention, and let me just stop here. Innovation equals invention. Often people mistake these two things for the same thing. Innovation equals invention. They are not. Innovation is something that generates value for the world. It makes something faster, better, cheaper. It gives someone some great satisfaction. An invention is an idea, a technology, a patent. In and of itself, it does not generate value. So these two are not the same thing. And sometimes you see them interchanged, and that's not correct. So innovation equals invention times commercialization. So And when we look at this equation of innovation, something of value, it requires a new idea, and then it requires someone or some organization that is going to commercialize that idea and to make it of value to the world.
What I decided to provide is the steps that I take when analysing my own questionnaires. However, before I begin, it would be useful to remind you of a few terms we use when talking about questionnaires. Questions can be divided into three types. This is sometimes called level of measurement. Firstly, we have category type questions, which are also known as nominal questions. These are when participants select from a list of categories for their response, such as male or female, or they may include ethnic origin. Secondly, we have ordinal type questions. These are similar to category questions, but instead of the categories being independent, there is some sort of order between them. If we ask people to indicate their age in categories, this is an ordinal type question. Thirdly, we have continuous questions. These are any question that can be answered by a number. It could be an open-ended question asking participants to tell you how many times they attended lectures or how often they used a VLE. Or it could involve asking them to rate the importance or intensity of some experience.
What we're going to discuss today is how the Port of London was discovered and what we discovered about it. Now, if you look at the historical records of Roman London, there's only about 14 actual references to London in antiquity, i.e. contemporary references, and of those, only one is in the 1st century. There are none at all in the 2nd or 3rd century. There's only one in the late 3rd century, and there's 4 in the 4th century. So if you're a historian trying to write a history of Roman London, it's very difficult. You don't really have much data. You're going to depend on the archaeological evidence, the material evidence of the port and indeed the town to have any understanding of what happened then. And so what we're looking at here is, how did we discover about the Port of London? There's no historical documentations, no customs books, no tariffs, no idea of the taxes. We have to understand the port entirely from the archaeological evidence. So that's what we're going to do today.
At the top, you would have a king. Now, the king would rule over a kingdom. Now, this is not so easy to govern, especially during the Middle Ages, and the king might owe many people things, especially people who helped the king come to power, helped him depose the previous king or to conquer this land. And so, in exchange for that, and to help govern, he might grant land or fiefs to other people. And the key currency in the Middle Ages under the feudal system is land, and land in exchange for loyalty and service. So this whole thing is a kingdom. Now right over here, this is a duchy. And a duchy will be controlled by a duke. I guess they didn't call it duchy because that just doesn't sound as serious. So the king might grant a duchy to a duke, and in exchange, the duke would provide
loyalty, pledge their fealty. If the kingdom is threatened, the duke will fight alongside the king, would provide their own troops. If the king wants to go conquer other territories, same thing. And also provide the king with taxes, which might be in the form of coinage, depending on what time and region we are in the Middle Ages, or it might be in the form of a percentage of the agricultural production from this duchy.
Milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. First, it is very grand, which most, especially later foundations, aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in the 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly, it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded, 900, 1,000, even in one case 1,200 years ago.
The World Health Organization estimates that 400 million people don't have access to essential health services. With a lack of universal healthcare coverage, 75% of cancer patients in Southeast Asia will die or experience financial catastrophe within 1 year of diagnosis. More than 80% of sub-Saharan African countries are critically short of surgeons, radiologists, and oncologists. And in 2016, more than 28 million people in the US were living without health insurance. Access is a multi-dimensional challenge. The solution is rarely as simple as a packet of tablets. 4 key factors need to be unlocked: disease awareness, diagnosis, healthcare capacity, and funding. With cancer, for example, successful treatment can be a complex blend of all 4. A patient needs to be aware of the disease and its symptoms. A clear diagnosis is vital to make sure the right treatment is chosen. Specialized teams working together need the right medicines and equipment. And funding is needed for healthcare investment and to protect patients from financial burden.
Today we're going to recount heroic tales of superhuman feats of strength, when in the face of disaster, some people are said to have summoned up incredible physical power to lift a car off of an accident victim, move giant rocks, or like Big John of song, single-handedly hold up a collapsing beam to let the other miners escape. Are such stories true? There are many anecdotes supporting the idea, but we're going to take a fact-based look at whether or not it truly is possible for an adrenaline-charged person to temporarily gain massive strength. In proper terminology, such a temporary boost of physical power would be called hysterical strength. The stories are almost always in the form of one person lifting a car off of another. And even lifting many cars by several inches still leaves most of its weight supported by the suspension springs. But our purpose today is not to debunk any of these specific stories. The majority of them are anecdotal, and interestingly, not repeatable. In many cases, the person who summoned the super strength later tried it again only to find that they couldn't do it. Basically, what we have is a respectably large body of anecdotal evidence that suggests that in times of crisis, danger, or fear, some people have the ability to temporarily exercise superhuman strength.
So that creates tensions, and that's what I want to talk about, because I think it's important that we are, as a society, able to have an informed debate about how much privacy is enough but not too much, how much security is enough but not too much. Privacy is a human right. That's simply quoting the Universal Declaration. In the physical world, we've got all kinds of protections. This is evidence that we care about our privacy. We've got doors, we've got obscured glass, we've got locks, we wear clothes, we put up shutters. And technology continues to erode the privacy that exists in the real world, in the three spatial dimensions. Security cameras, automatic number plate recognition take away anonymity. Long lenses, paparazzi, take away distance and the privacy that used to create. And body scanners are increasingly being used to see through clothes, for example. This process isn't going to slow down, and the new quantum technologies are actually being able to do gravitational sensing, and that's advancing at a remarkable rate, and you can't shield gravity. So some of the new quantum technologies are able already to see through walls, and there are technologies also for seeing around corners now using scattered light from lasers. Technology continues to erode privacy.
Welsh is a Celtic language spoken in Wales by about 740,000 people, and in the Welsh colony in Patagonia, Argentina, by several hundred people. There are also Welsh speakers in England, Scotland, Canada, the USA, Australia, and New Zealand. At the beginning of the 20th century, about half of the population of Wales spoke Welsh as an everyday language. Towards the end of that century, though, the proportion of Welsh speakers had fallen to about 21%. According to the 201 census, 582,368 people can speak Welsh. 659,301 people can either speak, read, or write Welsh. And 797,717 people, that's 28% of the population, claimed to have some knowledge of the language. According to a survey carried out by S4C, the Welsh language TV channel, the number of Welsh speakers in Wales is around 750,000, that's 750,000, and about 1.5 million people can understand Welsh. In addition, there are an estimated 133,000 Welsh speakers living in England, about 50,000 of them in the Greater London area. Frogs are a diverse and largely carnivorous group of short-bodied, tailless amphibians, composing the order of Anura. The oldest fossil found of a frog appeared in the early Triassic of Madagascar, but molecular clock dating suggests that their origins may extend further back to the Permian. That's 265 million years ago. Frogs are widely distributed, ranging from the tropics to the subarctic regions, but the greatest concentration of species diversity is found in tropical rainforests. There are approximately 4,800 recorded species, accounting for over 85% of extant amphibian species. They are also one of the 5 most diverse vertebrate orders. Besides living in fresh water and on dry land, the adults of some species are adapted for living underground or in trees. Adult frogs generally have a carnivorous diet consisting of small invertebrates, but omnivorous species exist and a few feed on fruit. Frogs are extremely efficient at converting what they eat into body mass. They are an important food source for predators and part of the food web dynamics of many of the world's ecosystems. Their skin is semi-permeable, making them susceptible to dehydration. So they either live in moist places or have special adaptations to deal with the dry habitats.
The Right Honourable Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was a British statesman, best known as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. At various times a soldier, journalist, author, and politician, Churchill is generally regarded as one of the most important leaders in British and world history. Considered reactionary on some issues, such as granting independence to Britain's colonies, and at times regarded as a self-promoter who changed political parties to further his career. It was his wartime leadership that earned him iconic status. Some of his peacetime decisions, such as restoring the gold standard in 1924, were disastrous, as was his World War I decision to land troops on the Dardanelles. However, during 1940, when Britain alone opposed Hitler's Nazi Germany in the free world, his stirring speeches inspired, motivated, and uplifted a whole people during their darkest hours. Churchill saw himself as a champion of democracy against tyranny and was profoundly aware of his own role and destiny. Indeed, he believed that God had placed him on earth to carry out heroic deeds for the protection of Christian civilization and human progress. A providential understanding of history would concur with Churchill's self-understanding. Considered old-fashioned, even reactionary by some people today, he was actually a visionary whose dream was of a united world, beginning with a union of the English-speaking peoples, then embracing all cultures. In his youth, he cut a dashing figure as a cavalry officer, as seen in the 1972 film Young Winston, directed by Richard Attenborough, but the images of him that are most widely remembered are as a rather overweight, determined, even pugnacious-looking senior statesman, as he is depicted to the right.
A mild form of hallucination is known as a disturbance and can occur in most of the senses above. These may be things like seeing movement in your peripheral vision, or hearing faint noises and or voices. Auditory hallucinations are very common in schizophrenia. They may be benevolent, telling the subject good things about themselves, or malicious, cursing the subject, etc. Auditory hallucinations of the malicious type are frequently heard. For example, people talking about the subject behind his or her back. Like auditory hallucinations, the source of the visual counterpart can also be behind the subject's back. Their visual counterpart is the feeling of being looked at or stared at, usually with malicious intent. Frequently, auditory hallucinations and their visual counterparts are experienced by the subject together.
Amory Lovins is an American consultant experimental physicist, and he has been active at the nexus of energy, resources, economy, environment, development, and security in more than 50 countries for over 40 years. He pays attention on energy saving and how to use energy in a more efficient and sustainable way. He built a house with plenty of energy-saving concepts. He's an unusual character with a wide range of knowledge and a genius, but he is not a scientist. He has a consulting company and lives in a house that was built on a mountain. For 30 years, he used a lot of ways to save energy and solved problems with technologies that already existed and demonstrate them. Some people think he is so crazy. A female writer wrote a book about him which is called Mr. Green.
Here are three important factors in creativity: people, process, and product. The most important one is the process. First, you have to create the right person through education with a creative mind. Second, you have to create the right process to have people engaged in the innovation process. Third, you need to find the right problem to work on. Human beings can survive and prosper largely depending on the creativity they have. If you identify and assess the creativity of a finished product, it is taken as a proxy for the creativity of the person who produced such a product. Therefore, a creative product should be surprising, original, beautiful, and useful. People should have factors necessary for genius, ability, and the right mindset. You should improve to imitate and change insight, look from new perspectives. Innovately create something with imagination to expand the conceptual spaces.
You can see that the two charts each give quite a different picture of the performance of boys and girls in the two key subjects of maths and English. It shows that in English, girls consistently outperform boys over a period of 6 years, achieving scores about 10% above their male peers. There is quite a different picture when we look at the maths results, with no real difference between genders in the results. What is the explanation for these key differences? To answer this question, researchers look at biological and cognitive factors and a range of social factors. The interaction between these different components in early childhood development are seen as maintained and reinforced in the school context, and this leads to distinct gender patterns of behavior in skills with direct consequences for school performance and achievement. The argument uses this evidence to show that biological factors, such as patterns of cognitive development, are closely linked to social factors, such as learned gender categories. These cognitive skills are learned both preschool and subsequently at school, supported by the responses of teachers, creating a reinforcement of patterns. In our survey, over 100 CEOs who had recently been through an acquisition or merger were asked which areas of their activities needed the most effort. As you can see, the most frequent response to this question was that information technology requires the most integration effort. According to 58% of those we surveyed, IT was the most time-consuming and needed the most work. This is understandable, as many of the IT issues are extremely complex, and the consequences of any change in IT can have a significant impact. The key is how quickly and effectively IT integration can be achieved, and there has to be a clear understanding of the consequences there may be of not getting it right. The two other areas requiring significant attention, sales, marketing and business development on the one hand, and financial management on the other, both were selected by 49% of the respondents.
Thermodynamics. All right, let's start. Thermodynamics is the science of the flow of heat. So thermo is heat, and dynamics is the motion of heat. Thermodynamics was developed largely beginning in the 1800s, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's the taming of steel, the beginning of generating power by burning fossil fuels, the beginning of the problems with CO2 in the atmosphere, global warming. In fact, it's interesting to note that the first calculation on the impact of CO2 on climate was done in the late 1800s by Arrhenius. Beginning of the generation of power, moving heat from fossil fuels to generating energy, locomotives, etc. So he calculated what would happen to this burning of fossil fuels, and he decided in his calculation, he basically got the calculation right, by the way. But he came out that in 2,000 years from the time that he did the calculations, humans would be in trouble.
They call it the marshmallow test. A 4 to 6 year old child sits alone in a room at a table facing a marshmallow on a plate. The child is told, if you don't eat this treat for 15 minutes, you can have both it and the second one. Kids on average wait for 5 or 6 minutes before eating that marshmallow. The longer a child can resist the treat, however, has been correlated with a higher general competency later in life. Now, a study shows that ability to resist temptation isn't strictly innate. It is also highly influenced by environment. Researchers gave a 5-year-old used crayons and one sticker to decorate a sheet of paper. One group was promised a new set of art supplies for the project, but they never received it. On the other hand, the other group did receive new crayons and better stickers. Then both groups were given the marshmallow test. The children, who had been lied to, waited for a mean time of 3 minutes before eating the marshmallow. The group that got their promised materials resisted an average of 12 minutes. Thus, the researchers note that experience factors into a child's ability to delay gratification. When previous promises have been hollow, why believe the next one? Flipping a coin may not be the fairest way to settle disputes. About a decade ago, statistician Percy Diaconis started to wonder if the outcome of a coin flip really is just a matter of chance. He had Harvard University engineers build him a mechanical coin flipper. Diaconis, now at Stanford University, found that if a coin is launched exactly the same way, it lands exactly the same way. The randomness in a coin toss, it appears, is introduced by sloppy humans. Each human-generated flip has a different height and a different speed, and is caught at a different angle, giving different outcomes. But using high-speed cameras and equations, Diaconis and colleagues have now found that even though humans are largely unpredictable, coin flippers, there is still a bias built in. If a coin starts out heads, it ends up heads when caught more often than it does tails. NPR's David Kestenbaum reports. The historic town of Mostar, spanning a deep valley of the Nevata River, developed in the 15th and 16th centuries as an Ottoman frontier town, and also during the Austro-Hungarian period in the 19th and 20th centuries. Mostar has long been known for its old Turkish houses and old bridge, Stari Most, after which it is named. In the 1990s conflict, however, most of the historic town and the old bridge, designed by the renowned architect Sinan, was destroyed. The old bridge was recently rebuilt, and many of the edifices in the old town have been restored or rebuilt with the contribution of an international scientific committee established by UNESCO. The old bridge area, with its pre-Ottoman, Eastern Ottoman, Mediterranean and Western European architectural features, is an outstanding example of a multicultural urban settlement. The reconstructed old bridge and old city of Mostar is a symbol of reconciliation, international cooperation, and the coexistence of diverse cultural, ethnic, and religious communities. The powerful influence of Stevenson's text on the discourse of dissociation is strikingly apparent in the work of American physician and psychologist Morton Prince. Reber credits Prince with pioneering the phenomenon of popularizing MPD as embodied in a spectacular case. Prince's Dissociation of a Personality, written in 1905, tells the story of Miss Christine Beauchamp, a pseudonym for Clara Norton Fowler, who, according to Prince, is a person in whom several personalities have become developed. The impact on young Australians who are interested in buying a home of their own has been very significant. Australia's housing affordability now shapes the typical housing cycle, or housing career as some people call it. Most Australians in the normal course of events are people who move through the housing cycle in a way that matches the stages of life that they are at. So, they move out of the family home in their late teens or early 20s as they gain independence from their families. Then, they rent, save for a home they can afford as either a group or maybe in a couple. And maybe they can upgrade it when they have a family in their middle age. They are more than likely to have paid off their mortgage. And that means they have housing security in their old age. That's no longer the typical housing cycle for Australians. Young people generally live at home for much longer than they once did. They generally rent for longer, and they're more likely to be saddled with a mortgage, not just into their middle age, but more often than not into their retirement as well. In fact, in 2006, 65,000 retiree households were still paying off the mortgage. Affordable rent is also an elusive right around Australia. We have very low rental vacancies. We see high turnover as landlords want to maximise their profits in tight markets. And we see less long-term or lifelong rental, as we see in other countries and other economies.
Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people, but this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life an innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. And he knew that the great cultures of Europe were there. He was not a product of a narrow American studies kind of training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much a part of life for everyone as conversation. He thought that Proust and Joyce and Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans and helped that to happen. Wilson was a very various man. Over a period of almost 50 years, he was a literary journalist, an investigative reporter, a brilliant memoirist, and dedicated journal keeper.
I've been thinking a lot about the world recently and how it's changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. 20 or 30 years ago, if a chicken caught a cold and sneezed and died in a remote village in East Asia, it would have been a tragedy for the chicken and its closest relatives, but I don't think there was much possibility of us fearing a global pandemic and the deaths of millions. 20 or 30 years ago, if a bank in North America lent too much money to some people who couldn't afford to pay it back, and the bank went bust, that was bad for the lender and bad for the borrower, but we didn't imagine it would bring the global economic system to its knees for nearly a decade. This is globalization. This is the miracle that has enabled us to transship our bodies and our minds and our words and our pictures and our ideas and our teaching and our learning around the planet ever faster and ever cheaper. It's brought a lot of bad stuff, like the stuff that I just described, but it's also brought a lot of good stuff. A lot of us are not aware of the extraordinary successes of the Millennium Development Goals, several of which have achieved their targets long before the due date. That proves that this species of humanity is capable of achieving extraordinary progress if it really acts together and it really tries hard.
Honeybees do a waggle dance to direct other bees to sources of nectar. But dancing bees like this one can be halted by a headbutt from another bee. Now researchers have found that this headbutt is actually a warning signal. A feeding station was set up in the lab to mimic a source of nectar. Then foraging bees were introduced to dangers at the station, such as competition from rival colonies. When foragers returned to the hive, they stopped bees dancing. Scientists think the behavior warns dancers of a dangerous source of nectar.
My name is Evie Carroll. I'm a second year studying international business. My degree subject is made up of tutorials, lectures and independent learning, and today I'm going to speak about tutorials. Before each tutorial, we're asked to prepare in advance. We're usually given reading lists, which we have to complete before each tutorial. We are given websites to look at, e-journals to look at, and we have to prepare by writing our notes down. In every tutorial, there's about 5 to 15 students, and these are led by the tutors, which are usually masters or PhD students. And then when we come into the tutorial, we are put into small groups, and we're asked to discuss our ideas, generate new ideas, and then feed back to the class. During our tutorials, there's lots of support given. Our tutors are there so that we can ask questions at any time. We also have our peers there, which we can also ask questions to. If we need help before the tutorial, we can email in any of the tutors and they'll provide you with help. The difference between lectures and tutorials is that in lectures you usually have about 200 to 300 students, whereas in tutorials there's about 5 to 15 students, which allows you to discuss matters, put your hand up and talk to your tutors about any difficulties you may have with a subject. The skills
Let's say if I'm asking which source do you often use to get information? Newspaper, radio, TV, and the survey shows 62% of the people chose internet. You might be thinking I am going to say how important the internet is, or how quickly it has changed the world for a few years. But what if I tell you this survey is conducted on the website globalandmail.com? Our answer will be different. Because the people who did this survey on a website must be frequent users of Internet. This sample is a biased sample. So we have to pay attention to how a survey is conducted.
口碑 PTE
Hello, I'm David Brown, curator of Italian and Spanish paintings at the National Gallery of Art. The treasures in our exhibition, The Art of Power, Royal Armor and Portraits from Imperial Spain, come from the Royal Armory in Madrid. They range from the 15th to the 17th century and include some of the finest examples of Renaissance armor in the world. Fabricated by master craftsmen and artists, the shields, helmets, and armor were made for Holy Roman emperors, kings, and the flower of Spanish royalty. This is parade armor, made for show, not combat. In form, it looks back to a world of tournaments, jousts, and noble gesture. And among the images worked into the steel is something quite different, a subtle advertising campaign for the imperial ambitions of the Spanish monarchy and the Habsburg dynasty. Those who wore it took the words Holy, Roman, and Empire
Far too many people often say things like, animals do this, but we don't. Or it's, this animal does this and that animal does this, but the humans don't do things like that. Those statements have some hidden assumption that we're not animals. When we say animals do this, animals do that, we often assume that we're not animals. If we're not animals, what are we? Are we plants? Or trees? Or flowers? No, we're not. Then, okay, we're not plants. Then are we microorganisms? Really tiny microscopic things? No, we're not. Then the natural conclusion must be we're not living things. Well, that's not true. Yes, we are animals, and I see animals in us, and I see humans in animals. So I'm going to talk about the animal behavior and human nature. In order to understand human nature, we can look into animals' eyes and animal behavior and find something about what made us who we are.